Good Erev Shabbos, Parshas Vayeira. Torah tells us of Avraham's significant nisayon, the test that he's given in terms of Akedas Yitzchak. And one can imagine, or one can only imagine, how difficult this test for Avraham must have been, as for any human being. And the test, of course, is the Akedah of serving up his son as a sacrifice on the altar to Hashem. However, the difficulty for Avraham in particular of fulfilling this particular nisayon is borne out both in the Mikra, in the Psukim, as well as in the Midrash. In other words, one might have assumed or thought that perhaps Avraham was some type of superhuman individual for whom these types of nisyonos, these challenges, might have been he might have been nonplussed by it. However, the Torah specifically tells us that this was a very difficult task for Avraham Avinu. And how do we see it? First, in terms of Mikra. Number one, the remaining part of the Parsha, or all the earlier parts of the Parsha, in large measure are about Avraham Avinu's sense of compassion and his disdain and his almost a reflex reaction to death. And we see that when Hashem tells Avram that he's going to destroy Sodom. And Avram is so pained by it, and he prays and he davens to Hashem and he challenges Hashem about meting out that punishment. The other significant portion of the Sedra is Avraham's dealing with the promise of having a child, and then having the child, and the joy and the contentment and everything that surrounds raising this child. So there is the first half of the parsha is about how difficult it is for Avraham to assume to abide by loss of life, and number two, how precious the child that is born to him actually is. That's in terms of the Mikra. So now that Hashem tells him, take this child and bring it as a sacrifice, one can again only imagine how deeply difficult this was for Avraham Avinu. And he was not in any way some type of superhuman individual who was nonplussed by this type of challenge. The Midrash too points out how difficult this was. Now there's a famous story in the Midrash that Avraham Avinu was on his way to the Akedah with Yitzchak, and the Satan, the proverbial malach who attempts to prevent us from doing Devar Hashem, from executing and fulfilling the word of Hashem, created a water barrier between Avraham and Yitzchak on the one side and the destination of the Akedah on the other. The Medrash says that the waters that he went into the waters until they rose up to his neck. He cried out to Hashem. He persevered. He would not stand down, and Hashem removed this barrier. So Rabbi Schwab points out that in Chazal, the Talmud tells us that water is a metaphor, is a remez for the midah of rachamim, and fire corresponds to the midah of din, of judgment. So water is the midah of rachamim, of compassion. So what is the Medrash telling us then when it says that the Satan created a river, a water barrier, went up to Avraham Avinu's neck? That is to say that Avraham Avinu was plagued by feelings of compassion, legitimate feelings of compassion. They were so strong, they were so powerful, that the Satan used them as a barrier for fulfilling the mitzvah of mitzvahs Hashem. And they rose, and he was almost overcome by his compassion, but he persevered and pushed through the impulse, even though compassion is ordinarily a very positive trait. In this case, compassion was used to subvert Avraham Avinu's will, an attempt to subvert his will to fulfill Dvar Hashem. And so here, he overcame his impulse for compassion. So both in the Midrash and in the Mikra, The Torah and the Chachamim are pointing out and emphasizing how deeply difficult the Nisayon, the test of the Akedah, was for Avraham Avinu. And in doing so, I think is not just telling us that Avraham was a human being with real emotions, and therefore the Akedah should not be looked at as simply just a par for the course type of thing for this super religious figure. No, Avraham Avinu was plagued by the difficulties, and he pushed through it nevertheless. And I think that in this story there lies a few messages that are applicable to each of us. Number one is that to live a life of Dvar Hashem, as we all know, is not always easy. It's not easy. And that's what makes, and therefore, we should draw some sustenance and encouragement from the story of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu is not a non-relatable figure. He is entirely us. And we have to, like Avraham Avinu, realize that what's easy for me may be hard for somebody else. What's difficult for me may be easy for somebody else. We each have our nisyonos. We each have our tests. But whatever our test is, for each of us, it feels like the Akedah. Whatever the test is, it's hard, it's difficult, and we have to push through our impulses to do in order to that our will to do Dvar Hashem should prevail. And finally, that Hashem only presents us with tests that we are able to master, with tests that we are able, nisyonos that we are able to overcome. And sometimes we feel a sense of despair, that we just cannot do it. But when we feel that sense of despair, that we cannot do it, let us remember Avraham Avinu. Hashem gave him a test that he could overcome, and indeed he did. And just as Avraham Avinu's Akedah, test of the Akedah, a powerful test, was one which one could forgive him for failing, nevertheless, we too also face our own Akedahs. Whatever it is, to us it feels like the Akedah. And if my neighbor's test is different than mine, and one which I feel is easy to do, and they feel is difficult, well, that's how it goes in life. Each person gets the Akedah that is relevant and is appropriate for them. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu give us the strength, the courage, and the faith to confront, to push through, and overcome each of our challenges. For after all, the nisyonos that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the tests that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Avraham Avinu, were only to help him realize his internal strengths and his internal capacities. And similarly, the nisyonos that Hashem gives us are also to help us realize the inner strength and the inner capacity that we have. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu bless us, that we are able to be successful in a joyful and vibrant way in all the nisyonos that he puts before us. Good Shabbos.